to the SEN Parent Survival Guide. This is a podcast for anyone who's concerned that their child's development is not atypical, or maybe you're one of the many people who are stuck on endless waiting lists for assessment and diagnosis, or maybe you have a child who is diagnosed but you're still feeling lost without support. Does this sound like you? If so, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode, because each week I'm going to be giving out tips and support on how to manage this complex journey when you're parenting a child with special educational needs and disabilities. My name is Esther Freeman and I'm a parent coach, an accredited tapping practitioner, but most importantly, I am a parent to a child with complex needs and disabilities. I get what you're going through because I have been there too. Now, this is the first episode of the SEN Parent Survival Guide podcast. It's also 10 years this week since I became a SEN parent. This is where I began my journey. I mean, I didn't know I was beginning my journey back then. I thought I was just becoming a parent, but it didn't turn out that way. And it would actually take me some time to realise that. And in that gap between thinking I was just a parent and realising I was a parent to a child with some really complex needs, I went through some really hard times. And I've been thinking this week, as I celebrate my 10th anniversary, if me now could go back and talk to me back then, back 10 years ago, what would I say to her? How would I encourage her? How would I know that it's going to get better, because it has got better? What words of encouragement could I say to her? And as I was thinking it through, thinking what tips and advice I might share with me back then, I was thinking there's probably a lot of other people who are actually in the position I was 10 years ago, that are in that position now, and they could probably do with hearing this too. And that's basically why I've started this podcast. Now, I also want to recognise that things have got a lot worse in these last 10 years. Now, I don't want to make this too political, but it is a reality that cuts to local authority budgets are dramatic, and this has particularly hit special educational needs departments very hard, along with a massive rise in the number of people, quite rightly, asking for support. And we're also seeing a real crush on resources in the NHS, and this has been compounded by COVID and lockdown, which has also, of course, affected the needs of our children and young people. So we're in really tough times, and I really want to acknowledge that and say, I see and hear you out there. I know how hard this is. So those of you who may have visited my website, which is the SEN Parent Survival Guide, sensurvivalguide.co.uk, get the website correct. I will put a link in the show notes. Those of you who've seen that will know that I have these 3 pillars of SEN parenting. So the first pillar is you, and the second pillar is your child, and the third pillar is your community. So as I was thinking along what I would give as advice to me back 10 years ago, I thought I would do it around this framework. And I thought that would help you understand it a bit more. So if you want to, as I say, just learn about those pillars a little bit more, you can go and see my website, but I'm going to be explaining it right now as well. So you comes first, because if you are not okay, your child cannot be okay. I liken it to when you're on a plane and you have those announcements that says in the safety instructions, put your mask on before your child's. And that applies for parenting a child with complex needs and disabilities too. You have to put your mask on first. And I know people bandy around the term self-care, and I have some apprehensions about that term, because having been there myself, I often felt I don't have time for this, and this just feels like yet another chore that I have to do. and I don't have time to do that. And actually, why can't someone else do it for me? Why does it have to be something I have to do? So what I've tried to do as part of the support that I provide and advise on is think of ways that you can look after yourself, which is really kind of quick and easy. So some of the things that I do for me now, which I wasn't doing back then and desperately needed, was just have a really good morning routine. So I get up a few minutes before my daughter and I do some yoga. Now, I am not doing an hour's yoga and meditation or anything like that. No, I do 5 minutes. But actually, I find those 5 minutes really good for just stretching out my muscles and getting rid of all the tension. Now, some people might prefer to do that before bed. I personally find I have trouble sleeping anyway, and I personally find that doing it before bed just gets me a little bit overstimulated. So I do it in the morning and just stretching out all those muscles, stretching my spine, stretching out my jaw and other places where I tend to hold tension, and I find that's really good. And the other thing I do every morning is 10 minutes tapping. Now, if you haven't heard of tapping before, it's a practice, a therapeutic practice that combines the ancient Chinese tradition of acupuncture with Western psychotherapy. And when I discovered this, I originally started using it on myself for my own mental health as part of my self-care. And I just found it so amazing because the results were almost instantaneous. And it only took 10 minutes to do it. You didn't, and it's free and you could do it at home by yourself. So there aren't these sort of costly therapeutic bills that you have to find the money for. You don't have to set aside like an hour or more to go and sit with a therapist. You can do it by yourself. You can even in the heat of the moment just disappear off to the bathroom, lock the door and do 10 minutes tapping to calm yourself down a bit. So I have lots of free tapping resources. So if you want to learn more about tapping, I will put a link in the show notes where you can get my free guided tapping meditation and you can give it a go and see how it works for you. So there are lots of other self-care things that you can do for yourself that are quite quick and easy. Just getting out in nature, going for a walk, moving your body, dancing around the kitchen to some music, whatever you can find time for. But do try each day to just schedule something in where you are looking after you, because if you don't, this job of a parent to a child with special educational needs and disabilities is not sustainable. So the next thing in the U category is getting rid of toxic people in your life. Now, for some of you, this won't apply. For some of you, you will have lovely, supportive people around you. But I hear all too often about people complaining about friends and family who just don't seem to get it. And over the years that I have been struggling with this, and at the beginning I really struggled with this, the thing I've learned, I'm sorry to say, that it's quite difficult to change the hearts and minds of these people in most cases. Those who don't get it now are probably never going to get it. And so what I would say is either stop having contact with those people. Is that friend who keeps telling you that your child just needs to be parented better, or you just need to get better handle on them, you need to get better boundaries? Is that a person you really need in your life right now? I mean, maybe you feel you do. And if you do, then maybe have a think about how you spend your time with them. So maybe it's going for a coffee with them and just not bringing the kids. If they say, let's take the kids to soft play, and you know your kid is just going to have a meltdown and you're going to feel like your friend's going to judge you, don't go to soft play with them. Go by yourself or find someone else to go with. And this might particularly apply for family, because that's what I hear a lot. some of these judgmental comments and criticism often come from family members, and it just doesn't help. And I don't know why they think that being spoken to like that does help you. I remember that I was really struggling with my daughter's behaviour. She was having meltdowns, not just on a daily basis, it was multiple times a day. She was just so overwhelmed, and we didn't really at the time understand what was going on with all her needs. And I was really struggling because she would have these meltdowns and they would go on for about an hour, and everything people told me to do, give them a hug, use a distraction, it didn't work. And in many cases it actually made things so much worse. Like you couldn't touch her, you couldn't hug her during a meltdown. She would just go completely insane and actually become quite violent. And so I learned that I didn't really understand why this was happening. I do now, by the way. It's sensory issues. So if you're going through this, if you're trying to hug your child and it's making it worse, chances are they've got some sensory issues. So maybe we will cover this in another episode, but you need to get your child assessed by an OT. Getting back to my point. So I had learnt that I couldn't hug my child while she was having a meltdown. It didn't make it better. It made it so much worse. And I didn't understand why, but I just knew I couldn't do it. And we were at a family's house one Christmas, and my daughter had a massive meltdown, and I was just doing what I normally do, which was sitting close and just being present and letting her know that if she needed a hug, I was there. But she was mainly just screaming and flailing around the floor. And this relative came by and just went, "Aren't you supposed to hug them when they do that?" And I was just like, oh my God, like I do not need this right now. I do not need, when I'm struggling so much with this child's behaviour, when it's happening multiple times a day, when I'm being hit and kicked and hurt, I do not need these comments from you. And it was very difficult to say that because they just didn't understand what was really happening. And what I've just learned is that when you're in these situations, it's best just to limit your contact. There's this term that they use in the medical community called titration, and it means it's normally used with medicines, and it means to introduce in small amounts so that you can build up your tolerance. But I would say that you sometimes need to titrate with your relationships, particularly your family relationships, and just do them in small doses. So at times like Christmas and birthdays, put a time limit on how long you're going to spend with that person. And don't stay at their house. Arrange to stay somewhere else. Or, if you live in driving distance of the family member, just go home. Limit the amount of time that you spend with them. It will benefit you because you'll be less stressed by all the judgment, and it will benefit your child because chances are if they're misbehaving, I hate that term, I don't know why I use that term, if they're playing up, if they're struggling, that's the word I want. If they're struggling, it's because a need isn't being met. And it might be because they are finding it really hard with all these people around them. It's just really overwhelming for them. So do yourself and your child a favour and just titrate on those relationships. So the next category is your child. Now, one of the things that I feel quite strongly about, and I know not everyone is going to agree with me on this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And if I had to go back to myself 10 years ago, I would say diagnosis doesn't matter as much as you think it does. And I say that because I was finding it really hard to get a diagnosis for my child. She didn't quite fit into the boxes that are available. And also, she wouldn't comply with a lot of the assessments. She just refused to do anything. She has massive demand avoidance. It's got a little bit better, but she still hates those assessments because she feels like she's being judged, and so she just won't do anything. And as a result, it was really difficult to get a diagnosis for her. And I also had professionals completely disagreeing with each other. I thought she was dyspraxic, and I had an OT who agreed with me, and the paediatrician said, well, she can't be because she can ride a bike. Now, I knew I had a friend whose child had just been diagnosed as dyspraxic, and he could ride a bike. And I was just tearing my hair out because I just felt I had to know, I had to have this label. And I really destroyed myself over it. And actually, it was quite unpleasant, I have to say. I remember having this conversation with an OT where I just totally lost my rag at her. And I don't know her name, but I would like to make a formal apology to that OT. I did not behave well. I was incredibly stressed. And actually, I was putting too much emphasis in that need to be diagnosed. My daughter still isn't actually diagnosed, although I think I know what she has, and I know it's going to be enormously difficult for her to get that diagnosis. And she doesn't want to do it. And she's at an age now where I feel I have to respect that. And the fact is, we have managed without it. We have talked together, me and my daughter, about her needs, about what I think has happened to her brain and how her brain works. And she gets that. And it's taken a bit of time, and there is some difficulties that she has around not being the same as her friends, but there is an increasing acceptance from her. And so I've basically just stopped chasing the diagnosis, and it lifted a massive weight off my shoulders. Now, that's not to say she doesn't have assessments. She does. She still hates them, but sometimes she just has to do them. So we have a massive educational psychologist assessment. It took a day and a half to do. It is extremely thorough. It is actually from that assessment that led me to believe that she has this particular condition, and led me to go and research that condition. And I act as if she has that condition, even though she doesn't have the diagnosis, and I don't know that she ever will. I use that educational psychologist report for all the support, like EHCPs. I sent it off to get my disability living allowance. I use it for all sorts of things. She has annual assessments from speech and language therapists. She also has some other additional assessments on a fairly regular basis, like every few years. So I keep the assessments going. But I've stopped chasing that diagnosis because it was driving me insane. It was actually causing mental health problems for my daughter as well, because she was just being dragged from one medical professional, child professional to another, and it was just destroying her. So we just let it go. And I think it's really important to know your child's needs. I think it's really important to talk to your child. But do you need the label? My personal opinion is no. Now, you might totally disagree with everything that I've just said, and that's fine. If you really feel that this diagnosis is important, if you think it will bring things to yourself and your child to know exactly what's going on, then absolutely go for it. But I would say, if your child is reluctant, then please don't push them into these things if it's going to really destroy their mental health. Because you can get things, you can get support without it. We have a very high level of funding for our EHCP. We have a place at a special school. We have higher rate care on the disability living allowance, and I have a bunch of other support. It is possible. I'm not lucky. That's what someone said to me once. It's not just because I'm lucky. I have worked hard. I have made sure my ducks are in a row. You can do it. And I would also say that if you are going to go ahead with the diagnosis and you're looking at a 2-year wait for that, don't feel that there's nothing that you can do in the meantime. So much of the support and help and healing that our children need comes in relationship with our child. So it happens between the parent and child. And on subsequent episodes, I'm going to go into this much more about what you can do at home. I actually heard a stat. I mean, I've not checked to see what the evidence for it, but someone said around 80% of the support, help, and healing that your child will do will be at home in relationship with you. So just bear that in mind if you haven't got the diagnosis yet, or even I know people who have gone for diagnosis and they've been told, no, sorry, you just don't meet the criteria. And that's another thing to think about, actually. If you're on the road to diagnosis, how are you going to cope if you're told, no, sorry, you don't meet the criteria? Because that can be really crushing when you think your child has this condition, or your child really thinks they have the condition, and then they're told, no, they don't. I do know a child that's happened to recently, and she's really struggled emotionally with it. So also think about that. I would say the criteria for all of these assessments are quite arbitrary. It's worth knowing actually how they come about. So there is a manual called the DSM, and this is where all the diagnostic criteria for things like autism and ADHD and OCD and all the rest of it, that's where the criteria is for these diagnoses. And every few years they do update it. But it's important to know where the DSM came from. It was basically created in the US on the request of American insurance companies, because as I'm sure all of you will know, in the US they don't have the NHS, and most people have some kind of insurance to pay for things like assessments. And the insurance companies wanted to know what they should and shouldn't be paying out for. And it was more complicated with mental disorders. I'm using the terminology of the DSM here. I don't really like that term myself. But it was difficult with them. It's difficult. People say it's just like a broken leg. No, it isn't like a broken leg. It's actually much more vague. We know a lot less about the brain and how it works. And the insurance companies just needed or wanted some guidance about what they should be paying out for. And that was how the DSM was born. So it was driven by profit, basically. It wasn't driven by people, it was driven by profit. And we've taken it on in the UK, even though it's a US initiative for US purposes, even though most people here use the NHS rather than have private healthcare cover. We use the DSM for diagnosis as well. And there is a growing movement. I saw a report from Cambridge University this week that said that we haven't got this right with the criteria yet. There's a lot of people at the moment that are saying autism and ADHD are actually one in the same. There's a range, because lots of kids will get a diagnosis for both, but there are some people who are saying actually it's the same thing. And there are such varying degrees of difficulties within these conditions. I mean, you can have two autistic people who are completely different. One might be going off to university and the other can't actually speak at all. So the wide varying needs within these labels also make the diagnostic criteria quite problematic, actually. So if you're not getting a diagnosis and you're feeling really upset, or your child's feeling really upset, no, this is not an exact science, and it doesn't mean that you don't have needs, and it doesn't mean you don't need support. And I would go and get those further assessments, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists. If you've got the money, go private. There's sometimes better quality, those private ones. Get those anyway, because they will list needs, and that means that you can still get support. So that was a rather long rant about diagnosis. And I want to now go on to my final category, which is community. And this is so important. I found that the support network I had around me when I became a parent quickly became just useless, basically, because these were not people on the same journey as me. And they didn't, some would be quite empathetic, and some were very supportive, but they didn't really understand fully what I was going through because their journey was so different. And that made me feel really isolated and really alone, because there's nothing worse to have a parent going, I don't know, my kid didn't really go through the terrible twos. They're a bit of a pain now at 3, but I don't know what people are going on about the terrible twos when you're sitting there and dealing with 5 to 6 meltdowns a day. And I have to say, no, I didn't do the terrible twos either. It started at 18 months old and went on to about 6 years. And it made me want just die inside when I heard people say that. And I just didn't know how to respond. And it made me feel so sad and alone. And I was really struggling, and particularly when my daughter started school, things just got even worse. I didn't think they could get worse, but once we put school into the whole frame, it was just awful. And the teachers were pretty hopeless, if I'm perfectly honest. My daughter masks. We'll do an episode sometime on masking, I'm sure, as well. And so she was going in, and she was going into school, and she looked like she was okay in school. But then I would pick her up, and for one thing, she would often wet herself in school, and no one had noticed. And then she came home, and she would have a massive meltdown. It's known as the Coke bottle effect, and I'm sure in future episodes we'll talk about masking and the Coke bottle effect in much more detail. And so I was constantly in and out, calling the school, just going, this isn't working, I don't know what to do, this is a nightmare. She was ill all the time as well. I mean, real physical results from the stress of school. And I remember this one teacher said to me, well, at least she's coming in. We had one child who would just cling to the gates, and she was like this for 2 weeks. And I just went, she's coming in, but she's not okay. And this teacher just looked at me and said, well, I've seen her, she is okay. And I said, well, she's not okay, because she wouldn't be coming home and doing all this stuff, and she wouldn't be wetting herself in the classroom and not telling anyone if she was okay. And I just felt so desperate because I could not get the school to take me seriously. And I have to say, I did end up taking her out of that school. We'll also be doing some more episodes on education, because I know that's such a hot topic. But just to say here, if you're struggling like this, taking them out of the school is an option, and I would encourage you to do it. But anyway, so I was feeling really stressed out, isolated. No one understood what I was going through. The professionals were just making things worse. And I was thinking about taking her out of the school at that point. And I know that there was another parent in the community. I didn't know her that well, but I know that she'd been struggling with her kid as well. And I know that she had taken her child out of the school that she was in. So I just sent her a message, and I just said, look, I'm really struggling. I don't know if you've got any advice. I don't know what to do. I'm feeling really desperate. And she just wrote back really quickly and said, do you want to come round for a cuppa? And I have to say, that cup of tea changed my life. It was such a lifesaver. It was one of the first times that I spoke to someone who I felt got it. And after that cup of tea, there may have been some biscuits. I can't remember now. But after that cup of tea, I came out, and finally I could see a way forward. It's not to say it went smoothly, but I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I realised at that point that I needed to have better community around me. And so I started joining groups. I joined my local parent carer forum. And if you have one locally, I would really encourage you to connect with them. You can find a list of the parent carer forums around the country on the Contact charity website. So I think it's contact.org.uk. I will put a link to that in the show notes as well. So check out your local parent carer forums. They're such an amazing resource. They do events, do social events, they do training events. Our local parent carer forum do meals out. Sometimes we just go for walks, and it's just a way to connect with other parents. And they have lots of social media platforms. So our group has a Facebook group, we have WhatsApp groups, we have all sorts of things. Now, if you're in a place where maybe you've just got a diagnosis and you're coming to terms with it and you're finding it quite hard and you're just not really ready to get out there yet, there are other things you can do. I mentioned before, the parent carer forums do just have Facebook groups, so you could just do the Facebook group for now. But also, there are lots of other online resources. There are lots of people on Instagram. There are people on Twitter. Twitter tends to be a little bit more stressful. So if you're at the beginning of your journey, maybe stay off Twitter. But Instagram is a very nice and supportive place. And also just being here. Thank you for being here, and well done for being here. Make this your community. I will be here every week giving you some advice. As I said before, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode, but I will be here each week and I would love to hear from you. So if you're enjoying this content, send me a review, be part of this community. So those are my 3 pillars of Zen parenting, a bit of advice for what I would tell myself if I could go back 10 years and meet her, that desperate, sad, tearful new parent who felt that she just couldn't go on. But I tell you what, she did, and she's here now, and things are still tough at times, I'm not going to lie, but I'm in a much better place. And I want to tell you that what you're going through now, if it's really tough, if you're feeling like it's never going to end, it will. Nothing lasts forever. There are bad feelings and they end, and there will be good times too. So I want to just leave you with that hope and positivity. Now, I'm still working out the format for these podcasts, and I thought I would try something for the ending of each podcast, and that was to talk a little bit about what's been in the news and what the chat has been on social media, just to reflect on some of the stuff that's going on in the wider community. And today I saw something on Twitter. I keep calling it Twitter. I meant to call it X now, aren't I? But it's still Twitter to me. And it was a clip from Newsnight, and it had the children's commissioner, and her name is Anne Longfield. Now, I've had mixed feelings about the children's commissioner in the past. I think sometimes they've said helpful things and sometimes they haven't. I would say in this instance, she was actually being quite positive. She was talking about the need for more and better support for children with SEND, special educational needs and disabilities, in schools. And she was talking about the high numbers of children who are out of school, either because, well, I think she was mainly talking about exclusions actually, although there are other children who are out of school because they don't have a school place and all sorts of other reasons. And if you are one of those parents, I am going to be doing some more work around education. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to do a whole package of things around education because I know it's such a massive issue for so many of you. Anyway, Anne Longfield was saying there needs to be more and better support. And she was talking to someone called Tom Bennett. No idea who Tom Bennett is. Apparently he's the advisor to the Department for Education. And oh my God, what a nightmare he was. I have to just read this thing out that he said. So they were talking about behaviours in schools and exclusions. And he said, people who advocate for no exclusions from primary schools are not dealing with this behaviour in the classroom. Now, I advocate for no exclusions for primary schools because they're little kids, and I think if we are saying we give up and we just exclude them from school at that age, where does that leave them in the future? There is also really strong evidence for what they call the school exclusion to prison pipeline, and I don't think when teachers issue these exclusions they think enough about that. So I think little primary school kids should not be excluded. They should be better supported. And Tom, as for you not knowing, as for you thinking that I don't know about the behaviour in the classroom, true, I'm not a teacher, I haven't worked in the classroom, but do you really think that this behaviour doesn't go on at home? And I'll tell you one big difference between us parents and you, the teachers, is they get to go home at the end of the day. We don't. When we're dealing with this behaviour at home, we're dealing with it 24 hours a day. In fact, the only bit of respite many of us that get is when our kids go to school. And when you exclude them, where do you think those kids go? They're at home with us. And it's predominantly women, not saying it's always women, but it's normally the mums who have to then look after those kids at home. And what happens to our jobs and our careers when we have to do that? And what happens to our mental health when we have all this disruption to our kids' routine dumped on us, and we have to manage it, and we have to manage that behaviour, and we do deal with that violence. I've dealt with that violence. Child on parent violence is real, and it is very, very serious and needs to be taken seriously. And I don't think teachers realise what they're doing when they're just sending these kids back to us. We don't get to walk away from it. They're our kids. So that made me very cross. And there was another great quote from him that I'm just going to have to share. The interviewer said, shouldn't we be listening to parents when it comes to decisions around their children's schooling? And his reply was, well, up to a point. And I just think that says so much about the attitudes of so many professionals in the education sector towards parents. And I just want to say to you now, you know your child best. You know your child better than the teacher. You may not be an educational professional, but you know your child best. And actually, the SEND Code of Practice, which is the policy that governs decisions for children with special educational needs and disabilities, says that the parent actually has equal weight in the decision making with the school and the local authority. So maybe Tom Bennett, if he's an advisor to the Department for Education, ought to swat up on his legal knowledge a little bit better, because actually we have equal weight. So I hope that isn't too dark an ending. I want to end on a positive note and just say I think it's really good that these discussions are happening, because it means that the conversations are out there, and it means that our voices are getting heard. And I think it was really good that the Children's Commissioner was actually voicing some really important things that parents have been saying. And it was good that Newsnight was covering this, because you don't often see these issues on Newsnight. So unfortunately, there are always going to be people like Tom Bennett saying ridiculous stuff like this. But we have to just keep fighting and letting them know what the truth is about this situation. As I said, if you are in this situation, if you're doing with exclusions and suspensions, I will be covering education stuff a lot more. So please subscribe. And please review. If you could leave me a review, that'd be wonderful, because reviews help other people find this podcast. And I just want more people to find this as a resource so they can join our community, so we can break that isolation, so we can get support to people who feel that they have nothing. So please review, please share it with a friend that you might know is struggling. Please share it in your WhatsApp groups and in your Facebook groups. That'd be amazing. Just so everyone who needs some help can get some help. So until next time, this is me, Esther Freeman, signing off from the SEN Parent Survival Guide podcast. I'll see you next time.